Thank you, Dr. Mandamachen. From the next talk, I wish for at least some hints how to slow down my personal life on a private and even better on a global scale, because I put trust in the quote, "The four major crises of our contemporary social world can be all reconstructed as crises of de-synchronization." This is one quote of the speech we're going to hear from Hartmut Rosa from the Max Weber Center of Advanced Cultural and Social Studies and DFG-Research Group on Post-Growth Societies. The talk is called Social Acceleration and Desynchronization, Key Concepts for Global Understanding. Welcome, Mr. Hartmut Rosa.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to be part of this fascinating project. On the other hand, I feel a little sorry for the audience because it's a kind of relentless stream bombardment almost of ideas and information which is coming down on you. So I really would like to keep my message short and simple, so to speak. With a Motorhead cover, I thought this might help you to overcome some sense of tiredness, maybe. So what I want to tell you is that it's two messages. I think if we want, if we try to understand the present condition of the world, and also if we try to make sense of what we call globalization, it is really important, to realize that maybe. I don't know whether you still use the concept of modernization, but if you do, or use the concept of globalization, it's important to see that we can understand the change of the world from the 18th century onward, and particularly in our age, in the 21st century. It's a process of dynamization, if you so like, of setting the world in motion, of speeding it up. That's my first claim, which I want to convince you about. And the second idea is that this creates problems, right? Because the world is not equally speedable in all its parts. Not everything can be sped up to the same extent, and therefore this creates victims, if you so like, right? Things which are too slow and which suffer the fate of the frog, which simply was not fast enough. So that's the idea. I want to move in 3 steps. The first is, what is social acceleration? And the second brief step is, how did it come about, or what is the driving motor of dynamization? And the third is what I just said. It's an analysis of the problems we are in. I think we all share a world which suffers from certain crises. We have heard about them already, the climate change or ecological problems. And in the last talk, there was the idea of democracy. I think democracy is a crisis as well, and there's at least 1 or 2 more crises. And I believe we can understand their nature and then can do something about it if we look at them through a temporal lens and see that it's problems of desynchronization. Okay, so that's the idea, right? So what is social acceleration? But you could really ask, what is globalization? What do we mean when we talk about globalization? And I think it's not the fact that, let's say, people or goods or money can travel vast distances, because people have done so for many centuries, like Marco Polo or the Vikings, right? Probably have sailed the oceans and so on. But it's the speed with which people, goods, ideas, money can now travel all around the world. In fact, I love when I talk to my students, I like to use this image of, let's suppose there is a kind of interstellar NSA, and they put up cameras in space, right? They are watching us. What would they observe? What would they see when they look at the world we share, right? I really believe it's very obvious, right? Before the 18th century, they would sometimes they would see people traveling, not very many, very often over long distances. They would see maybe Marco Polo traveling to the Far East, but it took him years to get there, and he stayed there a few years, and so on. And maybe the Vikings and some sailing boats and so on. But from the 18th century onward, there would be a very significant increase in movement, right? There would be the steamships coming around, and then very quickly also the railways, first in Europe and Northern America, and only over short sections at relatively slow speeds. But then the speed would pick up, and they would travel vaster distances and so on. And then the cars would come about. And by the way, even the bicycle is a kind of modern invention, right? So you see micro movements also in small spaces. And then, of course, the airplanes come around. As I speak here, the estimation goes that there's about 1 million, maybe even 2 million people up in the air while we sit here, right? At any point in time, 1 to 2 million people up in the air. So you really see modernization or globalization is setting the world literally in motion, because it's not only people who travel, it's also goods which cover vast distances. And then in our age, of course, it's capital permanently circulating the world, it's ideas, it's data and information. So I really think it's very easy to understand that what we did, what we still do, is setting the world in motion in even faster and faster speed. So I think when we think of modernity, for example, we have to understand that speeding it up is a core feature of modernization. And the consequence of this, acceleration is consequence of the fact that modern societies operate in a mode of dynamic stabilization. I will come back to this in a second. Let me just briefly outline what I mean when I say we live in the age of social acceleration, because it's interesting to see that there are 3 different dimensions of this process. One, of course, is technical, right, or technological. We do increase the speed of transport, I just pointed that out, but also we did increase since the 18th century onward, the speed of communication, of transferring data and so on, and also the speed of production of goods and also services. The Industrial Revolution was a speed revolution, and the digital revolution in our age is another speed revolution. We still increase the speed at a further level, but Klaus Töpfer was referring to the short-termism of our age. This is not, when he said that, he did not refer to technological acceleration, but to the speed of social change. The world around us is changing at a higher pace. The rates of change are changing for the background conditions of our action. You see that in changing technologies, you see it in changing patterns of association and in changing practices, and also the landscape of ideas changes, right? So there's an acceleration of social change. The periods of stability when the world stays the same is decreasing. Right, so if you so like, you could say there's an increase in decay rates, and this creates temporal pressures on us, the human beings, the human actors. You all know it from your own lives, right? Time is the scarcest commodity of the 21st century. Some say, and I think it's quite true, it's time, not oil, which is the scarcest commodity of the 21st century, because you can replace oil by other things, but you can never replace time. So we answer this by accelerating the pace of our lives. We try to be faster, more efficient in a temporal sense, to get more things done in a certain episode or in a certain amount of time, right? So this is what creates the acceleration circle, where one form of acceleration drives the others, but I don't want to get into detail here. So my claim number 1 is social acceleration means setting the world in motion and speeding it up in material, social, and in its intellectual fabric. And by the way, the climate change problem is literally speeding up the atmosphere, because heating up a gas means making the molecules move faster. And the fact that the material acceleration on Earth is driven by carbon-based energies has the consequence of also speeding up molecules in the atmosphere. Okay, so that's my first message. Now, step 2, where does this come from? I think it is important to see that the way we have structured our economies, in particularly, it's not only the economy, it's in fact it's also the scientific system, by the way, and even the arts. But modern societies, which develop basically all over the world now, they are characterized, that's my definition of modernity or of a modern society, that they are characterized by a mode of dynamic stabilization. And this means they systematically require growth, innovation, and acceleration for their structural reproduction. You very easily see this from the realm of the economy, right? If the economy does not grow, we cannot sustain the institutional level of jobs and of the economy and so on. You can study it in Greece and elsewhere, right? So a modern capitalist economy can only sustain its institutional structure, its status quo, through permanent growth. Or you can put it the other way around, as you see here, a money, commodity, money prime. Economic activity is only done, it's only driven by the prospect of creating some surplus value, some form of profit, which means there needs to be an increase, an augmentation for the stabilization of the system, right? So what I want to say is a modern society can only stabilize itself dynamically through increase, through permanent innovation, through economic growth, and through a speed up in society. And I'm not a straightforward Marxist, so I don't want to say it's only the economy, because I think in science we have the same logic, right? When you look at what we understand by knowledge, then the highest form is now science, and science permanently, it lives institutionally by pushing the border, going beyond what others did before. This logic of dynamic stabilization can be found in the science, in politics, and in the arts. I don't want to go into this in detail, but this is my main message, so to speak. We have established an institutional framework, quite pervasive, which depends on permanent dynamization. We structurally need growth, acceleration, and innovation to keep our societies as they are, to preserve the status quo. I mean, when you think in a global perspective, of course, there are large parts of the world, for example in Africa, but not only there, where growth, it does not mean preserve the status quo. It's connected to the hope of changing the status quo. But nevertheless, it's a kind of structural argument in the so-called, in this really so-called developed world, right? We need permanent increase just to stay as we are or how we are, to preserve the status quo, okay? Now this obviously creates, there you see why short-termism comes about and why time is the scarcest commodity, because time cannot be increased, right? Time is the only factor in the logic of increase that cannot be increased. We can create more goods and produce them and consume them and circulate them. We can have more contacts with other people. We can have more options at any one point in time, but you cannot have more time. We can only compress or condense time. So this is the logic of dynamic stabilization, creates a problem in the realm of time. And this is my last point now. This creates the problem of desynchronization. Not all segments of the world or of social life can be accelerated at the same pace. And that means that those systems, those parts, those groups, by the way, who speed up their pace, put systematically pressure on those parts or segments or groups which cannot speed up or maybe don't want to speed up, on the slower ones. And that creates a permanent risk and a growing risk of desynchronization. So I believe that the ecological crisis is really, in fact, a crisis of desynchronization. We have heard a lot of it already, because the pace of social processing and economic and technological processing is too high for the natural reproduction of resources and for the disposal of waste. It's not a problem if we cut down trees. What animals have done so, mammals have done so for thousands of years. The beaver cuts down trees, but not at a rate which is too high for the trees to regrow. And it's the same with fishing fish. It's not a problem if we eat fish, but it's a problem if we fish and we empty the oceans at a pace which is too high for the fish to reproduce. And it's the same with the production of emissions. If the production of emission is too fast, the rate of emission is too high for nature to dispose of it, then you get elements like climate change, right? Secondly, we've heard that from Nikos Dea that maybe democracy is the tool to deal with it. Well, in my perspective, there's a serious desynchronization between the pace of economic and technological processing and maybe cultural life and the media, and the proper logic of democracy. Democracy is a time-consuming process. Right? It's not about only saying yes or no. It's the idea of forming a deliberative space where arguments are formed, and when there's a kind of deliberation on what is the best way to proceed, and then there's some form of consent formation. And this is time consuming. And in a more complex world, and in a more pluralistic world, it actually takes more time to reach democratic consensus. But so on the one hand, we would rather need more time for a number of reasons. Democratic politics is increasing almost in the temporality, while the markets, for example, don't allow for this temporality. So there is a serious desynchronization between the pace of democratic politics and the speed of economic transaction. But even within the realm of the economy itself, there is desynchronization, because you can speed up actually the making of profits or economic transactions to the speed of light. When you look at financial transactions, the financial markets can be sped up almost to the speed of light. A lot of it is done through computer algorithms now, and through these transactions you create profits and you also create losses, of course. But the so-called real economy, producing goods and services and consuming them, is time consuming. It takes a hell of a lot of time to consume things, like to read a book. You only consume the book when you really read it, and this is time consuming. So there's a desynchronization between the pace of the financial markets and the pace of the material economy. And in the end, there also might be indicators, signs of a serious desynchronization between the pace of social life we create and the economic life and our individual psychic dispositions. There is an almost worldwide phenomenon called the burnout crisis, rising rates of depression. The World Health Organization estimates that this is becoming one of the most pressing problems, health problems, psychological disorders, and anxieties and stress, and in particular new forms of depression, or let's say increasing forms of depression like burnout, can very easily be interpreted as a desynchronization between the pace of the soul, to use very old-fashioned language, and the pace of social life. So I think we have to pay awareness to the temporal dimension to create global understanding and to find ways and means to tackle these problems. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks a lot.